This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that, under pressure, chose silence over function. Tonight, an entire country didn't lose its internet by accident. It was removed deliberately, not because the wires failed, but because the state did. When a government decides that millions of people must go dark at the same moment, it is not trying to calm a situation. It is trying to slow something it can no longer see, and that tells us something dangerous. In a modern society, information is not decoration. It is circulation. Cut it, and the body doesn't freeze. It convulses. What you're watching is not a communication outage. It's a test of control, of fear, of what happens when a system designed for obedience collides with a population that has already moved past it. Stay with me, because what comes next explains why this decision wasn't strength at all, and why it may have accelerated everything the system was trying to stop. Here's the assumption most systems rely on: that power flows from the top down, from leaders, from institutions, from force. But that's no longer what actually runs modern states. What controls stability now is not ideology or authority. It's flow, money, logistics, information, timing, and when those flows are smooth, power looks permanent. When they break, power looks brittle very quickly. In Iran, the center of gravity is no longer the leadership. It's the connective tissue that keeps daily life moving. Payments, work, school, hospitals, markets. None of that functions in isolation. It all depends on connection, which means when the state shut off the internet, it didn't just silence protesters. It interrupted the system it depends on to govern. That's the shift most people miss. This wasn't about stopping chants or videos. It was about buying time. Because when control depends on flow, disruption becomes existential. And the moment a government chooses to disrupt itself to survive, it reveals something critical. The system is no longer steering events. It's reacting to them. And that reaction set off a chain the regime cannot fully control. Because the most dangerous changes are never loud at first. They arrive quietly, normalized, until suddenly they're everywhere. That's where this story actually turns. For years, this tool existed in plain sight. Internet restrictions, temporary slowdowns, localized blackouts. They were framed as maintenance, security, short-term inconvenience. And slowly, people adjusted. Before, connection was assumed. Now, it is conditional. Before, silence meant something was wrong. Now, silence is policy. That normalization matters more than any single protest. Because the most effective systems don't rely on constant force. They rely on habits, on people learning what to expect and what not to challenge. But here's the problem. Slow change only works when society still believes the system is stable. What's different now is the timing. This shutdown didn't arrive during calm. It arrived during economic strain, public exhaustion, and nationwide unrest crossing cities, classes, and regions at once. That turns a familiar tactic into a stress test. When something people tolerated yesterday suddenly collides with fear about tomorrow, it stops feeling normal. It feels like loss, and loss sharpens attention. Instead of disappearing, anger condensed. Moved offline, moved closer into neighborhoods. Markets, apartment windows. The state assumed silence would fragment people. But silence can also synchronize them. And once that happens, control doesn't fade gradually. It destabilizes, which brings us to the moment the system first cracked, not symbolically, but operationally. The shock came fast. Entire provinces went dark at once. Not hours apart, not region by region, all together. As demonstrations spread to more than 100 cities and towns, including places that almost never joined the system, pulled its hardest lever. And that timing matters. Turnout was rising. Clashes were intensifying. Government buildings were burning. Security forces were stretched thin. This wasn't a preventive move. It was reactive. Human rights groups began reporting deaths. Arrests surged, casualties mounted, but with communication cut, verification slowed. Confusion spread. That wasn't a flaw. It was the point. Silence works best when it creates uncertainty. When no one knows how bad things are or how far they've gone, here's the partial truth. Blackouts are supposed to isolate protesters, make them feel alone, disconnected, expendable. Instead, something else happened. Businesses stalled. Hospitals struggled. Universities froze. Ordinary life seized up. People who were not protesting suddenly felt the cost. And that's the moment this stopped being a protest management tool. Because when suppression begins to damage the non-political population faster than the unrest itself, the calculation flips. Control stops looking protective. It starts looking reckless. And reckless systems don't just suppress opposition. They invite escalation. Here's what the blackout actually reveals. This system does not run on loyalty. It runs on distribution. Who gets access? Who gets cut off? Who absorbs the shock when things break? When the internet went dark, the damage didn't land evenly. It never does. Those closest to power stayed insulated. Backup lines, secure networks, redundancies. Everyone else absorbed the loss. Small businesses couldn't process payments. Workers couldn't show proof of work. Families couldn't reach doctors. Students lost access overnight. The mechanism is simple. Disruption flows downward. Protection flows upward. And the longer that imbalance holds, the more anger accumulates at the base. That's the hidden cost of information control. It doesn't just silence dissent. It redistributes pain. Meanwhile, the state gains something else: time. Time to reposition forces. Time to intimidate. Time to decide how much force to apply without triggering backlash at home or abroad. But time bought this way is unstable, because every hour of paralysis teaches citizens something new: that their lives are expendable in the name of control, that the system will break them before it reforms itself. And once that lesson spreads, compliance erodes fast. Which is why the next phase didn't look like calm. It looked like acceleration. Things sped up, not online, on the ground. Chants grew sharper, more explicit, less cautious. Markets shut their doors, not by order, by choice. Neighborhoods filled the gap the internet left behind. Walls carried messages. Windows carried voices. Word of mouth moved faster than algorithms ever did. Security forces adjusted. Drones appeared. Arrests became targeted. Force was applied selectively. That restraint matters. It wasn't mercy. It was calculation. Too much violence risks international reaction. Too little risks losing the streets. So the system hovered in between watching, measuring, waiting. But that balance is fragile. Because once people learn the state is hesitating, fear changes sides. Silence no longer feels like isolation. It feels like permission, and every hour without full control raises a dangerous question inside the system itself. What if this doesn't stop? What if the blackout didn't slow momentum, but stripped away the last illusion of inevitability? That's when pressure stops building gradually. It spikes, and the consequences stop being theoretical. This is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, not as ideology, as friction in daily life. Imagine your work frozen, your payments stalled, your messages unanswered. Not because of a storm, not because of an accident, but because the system decided you could wait. That kind of disruption doesn't feel political at first. It feels personal. You start counting risks. How long before rent is due? How long before supplies run out? How long before silence becomes permanent? And then something shifts. You realize this isn't temporary pressure on others. It's a preview of how the system treats everyone when it feels threatened. That recognition spreads quietly, across class, across region, across people who never planned to protest. This is how unrest widens without coordination. Not through speeches, through experience. If this matters to you, don't look away now, because the most important effects of this moment aren't visible yet. They're forming. And once they surface, they don't stay contained inside borders. They move outward. Once that shift happens, it doesn't stay domestic, because information control doesn't just fail internally. It distorts how a country moves through the world. When the blackout hit, international reporting slowed. Verification lagged, pressure was delayed, but it didn't disappear. Monitoring groups adapted. Eyewitness accounts leaked through workarounds. Governments watched closely, and something else became visible. Allies hesitated. Opponents signaled. Some stayed silent. That silence matters as much as statements, because authoritarian systems don't just calculate domestic force. They calculate external cost. Warnings from abroad raise the price of repression. Public support from others raises expectations inside the streets. And when those signals conflict, they create uncertainty inside the regime itself. Act too hard and invite consequences. Hold back too long and invite collapse. This is the danger of governing by blackout in a connected world. You can slow information. You cannot contain interpretation. Once global attention locks in, every move is amplified, every hesitation analyzed, every contradiction exposed. And the system is forced to operate under a spotlight it tried to turn off, which brings us to what happens next. Because from here, there are only a few possible paths. None of them are stable. From this point, the system is moving faster than its own safeguards. There are three paths ahead. The first is adjustment, limited concessions, selective reform, just enough pressure release to keep the structure intact. But adjustment requires trust, and trust is already thin. The second path is erosion, prolonged unrest, intermittent shutdowns, a slow grinding down of legitimacy while the system technically survives. This is the most deceptive outcome. Nothing collapses at once. Everything weakens together. The third path is rupture, a moment when restraint fails, when miscalculation meets momentum, when force is applied too broadly or too late. Rupture doesn't announce itself. It arrives disguised as control. Which path emerges depends on timing, on perception, on whether silence continues to work or finally stops working altogether. Right now, none of these outcomes are locked in, but the conditions that prevent rupture are narrowing. And the decision makers know it, because once a system shows it is willing to shut itself down to survive, it teaches everyone watching that survival is no longer guaranteed. And that realization changes behavior faster than any speech ever could. The ending hasn't arrived yet, but it's accelerating toward us. This story does not end with a victory speech or a crackdown montage or a clean resolution. Those are comfort systems offer after the danger has passed. This danger hasn't passed. What we are watching is a government discovering that its most powerful tool, silence, no longer guarantees control. When information becomes a threat, cutting it off feels logical. But when everyday life depends on connection, that logic turns inward. The blackout wasn't just a reaction to protests. It was an admission that authority now competes with flow. That fear no longer travels in one direction. That compliance can evaporate faster than it can be enforced. If you're still watching, that matters. Because this isn't confined to one country or one moment. This is a stress test every modern system will eventually face. And the question is not whether silence works. It's how much damage a system is willing to do to itself before it realizes it doesn't. Stay with this. Follow what comes next. Because the next phase won't arrive as news. It will arrive as consequence. And by the time it's obvious, it won't be optional anymore. I think that is no wire eyes, is no praise to G. If you want to continue tracking how this unfolds and why it matters beyond tonight, you'll want to see what comes next.